Deep in the village of Ravensdale, James Whitmore climbed through his own brother's window, carrying nothing but a jar of medicine, and stepped straight into the wreckage of his own life. There, tangled in sheets he once trusted, lay the very mate fate had bound him to, wrapped in his brother's arms instead. No warning, no explanation, just betrayal wearing a painfully familiar face. That same night, heartbroken and half lost in a forest that wasn't his to wander, James crossed paths with something enormous, white as frost, and far more dangerous than grief. Why would one broken bond lead him straight into the path of a king? Stay with us to find out exactly how it happened. James Whitmore had imagined a great many ways his mate bond might finally snap into place. He had imagined it in the herb garden, sunlight catching William's hair gold. He had imagined it at the spring festival, the two of them dancing badly and laughing about it. He had never, not once, imagined it would happen while he was climbing through his own brother's window, with a jar of fever tonic in his hand. The same fever tonic Robert had asked for that morning, before James had gotten tangled up at the apothecary, sorting a fresh delivery of dried yarrow and lost half the day to it, arriving hours later than he'd promised, jar in hand, guilt already half-formed on his tongue for making a sick man wait. Robert had not, as it turned out, spent those hours waiting and suffering. Robert had spent those hours considerably otherwise occupied. He had not imagined finding William Hart in Robert's bed, nor had he imagined that neither of them would be burning up with fever. For a long moment James simply stood there, one leg still hooked over the windowsill, the tonic jar forgotten in his fist, and did the only thing his brain could manage. He catalogued the room like a healer assessing an injury. 2 cups of wine, mostly empty, Robert's shirt on the floor, inside out, which meant he'd been in a hurry. William's boots, which James would recognize anywhere because he'd bandaged the blister on that very heel not 2 weeks past, kicked halfway under the bed. "This isn't," Robert started. "If you say this isn't what it looks like," James said, very calmly, still balanced in the window like a gargoyle, "I am going to drop this tonic on both your heads, and it is meant for chest colds, not concussions, so it won't even help." William, to his eternal shame, tried to pull the blanket up, as though modesty were the issue at hand. "James, sweetheart." "Do not," James said, "sweetheart me. We are bonded, William. Bonded. As in the thread. Every wolf in this village can smell on us, the thread I have been sniffed at about since I was 19. You couldn't have picked a stranger? You had to pick my brother?" "It only happened once," Robert offered, which was, James reflected, possibly the single worst sentence a man could choose in that particular moment. "Once," James repeated. "Robert, there are 2 wine cups. You do not open a second bottle of your good vintage for once." Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed, spectacularly unhelpful, as if even the animals of Ravensdale wanted no part in this conversation. James felt the laugh come up out of him before the tears did, an awful hiccuping sound that was not quite either, and he pressed the back of his wrist to his mouth to stop it, and failed, and ended up sitting down hard on the windowsill, half in and half out of the house, laughing so hard his ribs ached, because if he didn't laugh, he thought he might actually set the house on fire out of pure spite. "I came here," he wheezed, "with fever tonic." "William, are you even sick?" "No," William admitted. Of course not. James wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand. "You know what the worst part is? I don't even feel my heart breaking. I think it just left. It saw this, and it simply left the building, William. It did not even say goodbye to me on its way out." He climbed the rest of the way through the window, retrieved his cloak from where he'd dropped it on the floor, and, because he was, above all else, a healer and healers did not leave a job half-finished, even a job that had turned out to be an ambush, set the fever tonic gently on the bedside table. "In case either of you comes down with something," he said sweetly, "for lying to your own blood in your own bed, take 2 spoonfuls. It tastes like feet." Then he left through the door like a person with dignity, made it exactly to the end of the lane, and burst into tears so violently that a passing goose honked at him in what he chose to interpret as sympathy. He did not go home. Home had William's scent baked into the doorframe from years of visits, and Robert's laugh through the wall, and James found that he could not bear either. So he did the only sensible thing a heartbroken young man with excellent instincts and terrible judgment could do. He walked into the forest at the edge of the village, the one everyone said belonged to the king of Drachenfels, the one nobody from Ravensdale ever entered, because the king's wolves patrol it, and you do not want to meet one unannounced. And he kept walking until the trees swallowed the last of the daylight, and he had absolutely no idea how to get home. Wonderful, James told a very unimpressed pine tree, heartbroken and lost. William would be so proud of how efficiently I've ruined my own evening. Something enormous moved in the dark between the trees, and every hair on James's body stood straight up. The creature that stepped into the moonlight was not a wolf so much as an argument for why wolves ought to be illegal. It stood taller at the shoulder than James's waist, coat white as frost on a window, eyes a pale, unnerving gold that seemed to hold more thought in them than any animal had a right to. James, who had spent the last hour crying, laughing, and walking directly into low branches, looked up at 800 pounds of apex predator and said, "Oh, fantastic. Are you going to eat me? Because I have to warn you, I've had an extremely bad day, and I will taste like heartbreak and poor decisions, very bitter, not recommended." The wolf did not attack. The wolf, in fact, sat down. "You're just going to sit there?" James pressed a hand to his chest, where something had gone strange and tight the moment those gold eyes met his. A warmth, low and insistent, utterly unlike the cold, sick lurch he'd felt watching William pull up that blanket. He didn't have the emotional bandwidth left that night to examine it properly, so he did what any sensible person does with an inconvenient feeling. He ignored it and kept talking. "Fine, sit there, judge me. Everyone else has had a turn today. Might as well let the local wildlife have a go too. Go on, tell me what I did wrong." "Was it the window?" "I bet it was the window. A smarter man would have knocked." The wolf tilted its head. Something in the gesture was unmistakably amused, which was an absurd thing to think about an animal, and James decided not to think about it further. "You know," he continued, mostly to hear a voice that wasn't his own thoughts screaming, "the stories say the king's wolves are supposed to be terrifying. Very impressive, very fear the forest, tremble mortal. You're just sitting there like a large, smug dog. I'm almost disappointed. I walked all this way hoping for a dignified mauling, and instead I get audience participation." The wolf huffed, an honest-to-goodness huff, disgusted and delighted at once. And James, despite everything, felt his mouth twitch upward for the first time since the window. That was when the bond thread, dormant and thin as it had always been with William, did something it had never once done in 3 years. It sang. It roared to life so suddenly that James's knees buckled, and he grabbed a tree trunk to keep upright, breath punching out of him, because there was no mistaking that pull low in his chest. A hook sunk clean through him and yanked taut, not toward the direction of Ravensdale, not toward William at all, toward the wolf sitting 3 feet away, watching him with those pale gold eyes gone suddenly achingly soft. "No," James said faintly. "Absolutely not. I do not have the emotional reserves for a second mate bond tonight. The universe needs to space these out." "This is poor scheduling on your part, universe." The wolf rose, moved closer, slow, deliberate, the way one might approach something easily frightened, and it was such a gentle, careful motion from something so large that James's chest ached with it. He should have run. He didn't. He stood very still while the wolf pressed its great head against his hand, warm and solid and real, and the bond thread hummed under his skin like a struck bell finally settling into its true note. "Oh," James whispered. Into the dark, into the fur under his fingers. "Oh, that's not fair at all." The wolf stepped back, and light gathered around it the way morning gathers at the edge of the sky. Not sudden, but inevitable, and where an animal had been there stood a man. He was, James thought with the particular clarity of someone in shock, aggressively good-looking, in the way of people who had never had to try. Dark hair damp at the temples as though he'd shaken off rain, broad through the shoulder. A jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with a grudge against soft edges. He wore only the loose trousers that shifters kept tied at their ankle for exactly this purpose, and he was watching James with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and barely restrained laughter. "Large, smug dog," the man repeated. James closed his eyes. "You heard that part. I heard all of it. Audience participation." A slow smile broke over his face, transforming it entirely. James felt the bond thread tug harder, delighted, treacherous thing. "I'm afraid I have to disappoint you further. I'm not one of the king's wolves." "Oh, good," James said, relief loosening his shoulders. "So I only insulted a regular enormous wolf and not. I am the king." James opened his eyes very slowly. "You're Michael Draven," said the king of Drakenfels, and bowed, actually bowed, to a heartbroken village healer who had wandered into his forest and called him a smug dog, of the House of Draven, currently very smug as accused. For the second time that night, James felt laughter and tears arrive at once, though this time the laughter won by a wider margin. I called the king judgmental. You did. I told the king I hoped for a dignified mauling. You did that too. I am going to walk into that tree over there, James said, pointing, and simply live in it now. It's less humiliating than whatever this is. Please don't, Michael said, and something in his voice had gone quiet and entirely sincere. The teasing dropped like a coat shed at a doorway. Stay. I felt it too, when you touched me. I haven't felt a bond in 28 years of looking. I'd rather you didn't move into a tree before I've even learned your name. James looked at him, really looked, past the crown he wasn't wearing, and the title that should have terrified him, to the 2 spots of color high on his cheekbones, the way his hands had curled slightly at his sides, as if he weren't sure what to do with them, now that he was a man and not a wolf. He was nervous. The Alpha King of Drakenfels was nervous, standing barefoot in his own forest, because a healer from Ravensdale might walk away. Something in James's chest, still raw from the afternoon, went soft instead of hard. James, he said. James Whitmore, I'm a healer's apprentice. I climbed through my brother's window this morning to give him fever tonic, and found my former mate in his bed. So I want to be very clear that I am not currently in possession of good judgment, and this is a terrible time to be meeting the love of my life. Michael's mouth twitched. Former mate? The bond broke the second I touched you. I assume that's not normal. It isn't, Michael agreed, and there was something fierce and quiet under the words. A true bond doesn't break for anything less than true betrayal. Whatever you had with him, it wasn't what you have now. It was never going to be. That's either the kindest or the most convenient thing anyone said to me all day. Perhaps both, Michael said, and held out his hand, not grasping, just open, an offer. Come back to the castle. Let me feed you something that isn't heartbreak, and you can insult my dignity further once you're warm. James looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then at the man behind it, gold eyes gentled to something warm as candlelight, and found that his feet had already decided for him. If there's a smug painting of you somewhere in that castle, he said, taking Michael's hand, I want to see it immediately. There are several, Michael admitted and laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, as he led James out of the dark. Drakenfels castle was carved half into living rock, its towers rising pale against the dawn like something grown rather than built, and James arrived at its gates, at first light in borrowed boots, hand still loosely folded in the king's, looking exactly like what he was, a village healer who had had the strangest night of his life. The gate guards did not know what to make of him. Neither did the kitchen maid, who found him wandering the east corridor an hour later, having lost Michael to some urgent council matter, and promptly decided he must be new staff. You're late, she informed him, thrusting a tray into his arms. Lord Fenwick's breakfast, 3rd guest chamber, and mind you don't spill the honey again. Cook's still cross about Tuesday. I didn't spill honey on Tuesday, James said. I wasn't here on Tuesday. That's what the last boy said too, she said, unbothered, and swept off. James looked down at the tray. He looked down the corridor. He considered, briefly, simply eating the pastries himself and blaming a wolf, and then his healer's conscience won out, and he went looking for the 3rd guest chamber, because someone, somewhere, was presumably hungry, and it wasn't his fault the castle ran like a beehive that had misplaced its map. He found the 3rd guest chamber, and the man behind its door, who turned out to be a strikingly handsome noble, with dark curling hair, and an easy smile that widened considerably when James entered. Well, said the man, Lord Daniel Fenwick, though James didn't know that yet. They've upgraded the service. What's your name, James? I'm not actually. James, Daniel repeated, warm as summer, taking the tray from him with fingers that lingered a half-second too long over James's own. A pleasure, truly. Tell me you're staying the week. I'm not staff, James managed, flustered in a way that had nothing to do with the bond thread, which sat quiet and unbothered in his chest. A small, useful mercy, since it meant he could tell, with total clarity, that whatever this fluttering was, it wasn't that. Just a man being handsome at him, the way handsome men occasionally were. Pity, Daniel said, and smiled again, and James excused himself with the speed of someone who had had quite enough surprises for 1 week. Thank you. He did not get very far. He rounded the corner directly into Michael, who had apparently abandoned his council meeting with impressive speed, and who was wearing an expression James hadn't yet catalogued. Something tight around the eyes, something that did not match the easy warmth of an hour before. "You were in Lord Fenwick's chamber," Michael said. "Not a question. I was delivering his breakfast. Apparently I look like staff. Is that—" James studied him. "Are you scowling?" "I don't scowl. You are radiating scowl. I can feel it through the bond, I think. There's a sort of—" James waved a hand vaguely at his own sternum, simmering. Behind Michael, a man James hadn't noticed leaned against the corridor wall with the particular satisfaction of someone about to enjoy his king's discomfort immensely. He was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and clearly delighted. "Charles Leonard," he introduced himself, before Michael could stop him. "Beta Commander, oldest friend, professional witness to whatever this is. He's not scowling, by the way. He's jealous. I've known him 20 years. I know the face. I am not." "You growled at breakfast?" Charles said cheerfully. "The kitchen maid told me. Apparently you asked, very pointedly, who ordered Lord Fenwick's tray delivered by the new healer, in a tone that made her think you might set something on fire." James looked between them, the king, jaw tight and ears going faintly pink, the commander thoroughly enjoying himself, and felt a grin spread slow and helpless across his own face. "You're jealous," he said. "You're the king of an entire kingdom, and you're jealous over a breakfast tray." "I'm not jealous," Michael said, with the dignity of a man who is extremely jealous. "I simply prefer to know who is wandering my castle unescorted." James said. "Well, for what it's worth, Your Majesty, Lord Fenwick has very nice hair, and absolutely nothing else worth mentioning." The tips of Michael's ears went entirely scarlet, and Charles laughed so hard he had to brace himself against the wall, and James decided, watching the King of Drachenfels try and fail to look unaffected, that he could get used to this particular kind of chaos. It took James exactly 4 days to declare the castle's infirmary a disgrace, and exactly 4 hours after that to have it entirely reorganized, much to the bewilderment of the elderly healer who'd run it, unbothered, for the past 30 years. "You've alphabetized the tonics," Old Master Ulrich said, surveying the shelves with the air of a man watching his life's work quietly mutinize against him. "They were sorted by color before," James said, scandalized. "Do you know how many patients could have been given the wrong tincture? Red for fever, red for sleeping draught. Those are not the same thing, Master Ulrich. One of them is considerably more dangerous to confuse. We've never had an incident. You've been lucky." Master Ulrich, rather than taking offense, laughed so hard he had to sit down, and by the end of the week had unofficially declared James his successor, on the grounds that the boy actually reads the labels, which is more than I can say for myself these days. James's first real patient at Drachenfels was, unsurprisingly, a wolf, a young sentry named Otto who'd caught his paw in a hunter's trap along the northern border and been carried in howling, more from indignity than actual pain, as it turned out, once James got a proper look at the wound. "It's a scratch," James informed him, cleaning it with brisk, practiced hands, while Otto whimpered theatrically from the table. "You'll live. You may even survive without a single scar to complain about at the tavern." "It's deep," Otto insisted, in the wounded tone of a very large young man who had clearly expected more sympathy. "I have delivered a breech calf with less complaining than this," James said, and Charles, who had wandered in to check on his sentry, and stayed to watch the proceedings purely for entertainment, laughed so hard he nearly fell off the shelf he'd perched himself on. "He's ruthless," Charles told Michael later, delighted, when the king came to check on the infirmary's newest addition. "Absolutely ruthless. Otto's been milking that scratch for sympathy from every maid in the castle for 2 days, and your mate diagnosed him in under a minute and told him to stop whimpering. He does that," Michael said. And there was such open fondness in his voice that Charles glanced between the two of them. Michael leaning in the infirmary doorway, James elbow-deep in restocking bandages, entirely absorbed in his work and utterly unaware of the king's expression, and decided privately that he'd never seen his old friend look quite so thoroughly, helplessly happy. James's second week brought a steadier stream of patients, training injuries, a kitchen boy who'd burned his hand, an elderly beta with joints that ached worse every winter, and memorably, Charles himself, who arrived one afternoon with a sprained wrist from training and immediately attempted to negotiate his way out of James's care. "I don't need a healer," Charles said, cradling his wrist and wincing every time he moved it. I need a strong drink and possibly a nap. You need a splint, James said, already reaching for one. Sit down before I make Michael order you to. You wouldn't. I absolutely would. Michael, James called, not even looking up. Come tell your beta commander to sit still. Sit still, Charles, Michael said obligingly, from where he'd been leaning in the doorway watching the whole exchange with barely restrained amusement. Charles sat. James splinted the wrist with quick, sure hands, lecturing the entire time about proper training form, in a tone that had Charles apologizing to a wrist injury by the end of it, purely to make the scolding stop, and Michael watched the whole performance with the specific quiet joy of a man who had never once imagined his castle could feel this warm, this full of ordinary noise and ordinary care, until James Whitmore had walked into it uninvited and simply refused to leave. You've turned my infirmary into the most popular room in the castle, Michael told him that evening, finding James scrubbing dried herbs from his hands at the wash basin, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from its tie. It was already popular. I just made it competent. James flicked water at him, grinning when it caught Michael square in the jaw. Your people are dreadful patients, by the way. Every single one of them tries to negotiate with me. I healed a man's broken finger yesterday, and he tried to bargain me down to half a splint. They're not used to being told no, Michael said. Most of the staff are terrified of displeasing me, and rather too fond of flattering me besides. You're the first person in this castle who's told me to sit still and stop complaining since I was perhaps 9 years old. Would you like me to stop? Absolutely not, Michael said, catching James's damp hand and pressing a kiss to the back of it, herbs and all. It's my favorite thing about you. Don't you dare change it. They gave James a room with a window that looked out over the Rhine, silver and slow-moving far below, and a wardrobe he insisted 3 times that he did not need filled with new clothes, insistence that Michael ignored so thoroughly that by the end of the week James owned more shirts than he had in his entire life in Ravensdale. This is bribery, James told him, over breakfast on the 7th day, holding up a soft blue tunic that fit as though it had been made for him, because it had. It's a gift. It's bribery with excellent tailoring. James pulled it on anyway, because it was warm and it smelled faintly of cedar, and it was, he privately admitted, the nicest thing he'd ever worn. You're trying to court me. Is it working? Terribly, James said, and grinned at the way Michael's whole face eased at that, like a held breath finally let go. They found their rhythm in small things. Michael, who governed a kingdom of wolves with a voice that could quiet a war council, turned out to be catastrophically bad at anything requiring patience with living plants. And James caught him 3 separate times attempting to secretly replace the herb garden seedlings he'd trampled, with his own enormous paws the previous night, moonlighting as a wolf who apparently could not resist chasing rabbits through cultivated soil. You've killed the chamomile again, James informed him, crouched in the dirt, surveying the damage with the particular despair of a healer whose supplies kept dying under royal paws. This is the 3rd time. Are you doing this on purpose so I have to keep coming out here to fuss at you? Michael, human again and entirely unrepentant, settled onto the garden wall beside him. The rabbits started it. The rabbits did not plant new chamomile at midnight and then stand there looking innocent, Michael. I have no idea what you're implying. You have dirt on your knees right now. Gardening is a noble pursuit, Michael said with the straight face of a man who had never once gardened voluntarily in his life, and James laughed so hard he had to sit down properly in the dirt, and Michael watched him do it with an expression so unguarded, so full, that James's laughter faded into something quieter, warmer, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Just sat in the ruined chamomile bed, with the morning sun coming warm and gold through the garden wall, close enough that James could feel the heat of him, close enough that the bond thread pulled taut and singing between them. You have dirt on your face too, Michael said eventually, voice gone low, and reached over, slow, so slow, giving James every chance to pull away, and brushed a smear of soil from his cheekbone with a thumb that lingered a heartbeat longer than the task required. James did not pull away. He leaned, very slightly, into the touch, and felt Michael's breath catch, and thought, oh, there it is. There's the second moment I'll remember for the rest of my life. Michael, I think you should kiss me before one of us finds another excuse not to. Michael did not need to be told twice. It was soft at first, careful, the way his approach in the forest had been careful, like James was something that might startle and run. But James curled a hand into the front of his shirt and pulled him closer, and Michael made a sound low in his throat and stopped being careful at all, kissing him properly, thoroughly, one hand cradling the back of James's head like something precious. And the bond between them didn't just sing. It roared, bright and certain, and James thought, dizzily, that William Hart could keep his brother, could keep the wine and the boots and the whole miserable house, because James had traded all of it for this, and it was not a close contest. They broke apart only because Charles cleared his throat loudly from the garden gate, arms crossed, grinning like a man who had won a bet. Finally, he said, the staff had a wager going. I believe I'm owed several silver pieces. Charles, Michael said, without looking away from James. Go away. Gladly, Charles said, and left whistling. Michael taught him to run with the pack on a cold, clear night, 2 weeks after the kiss in the chamomile bed, and James discovered within the first 10 minutes that being an ordinary human tagging along after a company of wolves was significantly more humbling than he'd anticipated. You could turn, Charles pointed out unhelpfully, trotting alongside him in his own brindled coat while James stumbled over a root for the 3rd time. You do have a wolf, you know, somewhere under all that healer's composure. I've never shifted, James admitted, breathless, catching himself on a low branch. Not once. My family's line runs weak. Robert can barely manage it either, and even then only on the full moon, and it takes him the better part of an hour to talk himself into it. Michael, pacing ahead of them in human form for James's sake, slowed until he fell into step beside him instead, close enough that his shoulder brushed James's with every stride. It isn't a competition, he said. Half my court would kill to walk through a forest at night simply talking, the way we're doing now. Instead of run themselves breathless chasing rabbits they'll never catch. You say that, James said, but I saw your face the first night. You looked delighted to be enormous and terrifying. I contain multitudes, Michael said gravely, and James laughed loud enough to send a startled owl flapping up into the dark, and did not think again, for the rest of that night, about the shape he wasn't, and had never been able to become. It was Michael who brought it up again, much later, once the pack had scattered back toward the castle, and the two of them had claimed a quiet hollow beneath an old beech tree to watch the moon clear the ridgeline. Does it trouble you, he asked, not shifting? James considered the question honestly, turning it over the way he turned over a difficult diagnosis, testing it from every angle before he answered. It used to. Growing up, everyone else in Ravensdale could at least manage it by 15, even badly, even just for a few clumsy minutes, and I never could. I used to sit out in the yard on full moons trying so hard I'd give myself a headache, and nothing would happen, and I'd go back inside feeling like half a wolf wearing a person's face full time. He picked at a blade of grass, working it between his fingers. William used to tease me about it. Gently, or so he called it. I don't think it was gentle at all, looking back. It wasn't, Michael said, low and certain, no room in his voice for doubt. There is nothing lesser in you, James. Some of the finest healers in my grandfather's court never shifted a day in their lives. Their strength ran differently, into their hands and their patience instead of their claws. I'd wager you've saved more lives with that fever tonic you make than I've saved with an entire garrison of teeth and claws. That's a generous comparison. It's an accurate one. Michael reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from James's face, unhurried, the gesture so achingly tender that James felt his breath catch. I fell for the shape of you exactly as you are. 2 legs, terrible aim with a chamomile plant, absolute change, no wolf in sight. I wouldn't look change a single piece of it. Moonlight silvering the sharp planes of his face, gold eyes gentled to something almost unbearably soft, and felt the old ache about his missing wolf loosen its grip on him, just slightly, just enough. You're going to make me cry under a beech tree, he warned, voice not quite steady. That's not a very kingly thing to do to a person. I have excellent aim, apparently, even if you don't. Michael pulled him close, tucking James's head beneath his chin, warm and solid and smelling of pine and wood smoke. Cry if you need to. I'll simply hold on until you're done, and then we'll walk home together, on however many legs you like. James did cry, a little. Quiet, unhurried tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the strange, overwhelming relief of being fully known and wanted anyway, and Michael held him through it without a single word of impatience, and afterward they did walk home together, slow and unbothered, 2 legs each, hand in hand beneath a sky gone thick with stars. The autumn feast at Drachenfels was, by all accounts, meant to be a diplomatic affair. Nobles from 3 neighboring packs gathered to discuss trade routes and border patrols, and other matters James understood approximately none of. What it became in practice was the most entertaining evening of his entire life. It started innocently. Lord Daniel Fenwick, seated 3 places down the long table, had apparently decided that James's earlier rejection had been a matter of poor timing rather than genuine disinterest, and spent the better part of an hour finding excuses to lean across the table, to pass the bread, to admire James's cup, to inquire with theatrical concern whether the castle's new healer was finding his position agreeable. "I keep telling people I'm not staff," James murmured to Michael, "and they keep not listening." "He knows you're not staff," Michael said, in the flat, controlled voice of a man restraining several less diplomatic instincts. "He's doing it on purpose, is he? He wants to see me lose my composure in front of the Eastern Packs. Are you going to?" "No," Michael said, with the tight certainty of a man who absolutely was going to, the moment provocation arrived. Provocation arrived roughly 4 minutes later, when Daniel, leaning across the table once more, ostensibly to refill James's wine, let his hand rest deliberately over James's on the tablecloth. The growl that came out of Michael was not remotely human. The hall went silent. Several nobles half rose from their seats. Charles, 2 chairs down, put his face in his hands with the weary patience of a man who had seen this exact scene coming from a mile off and had bet accordingly. "Lord Fenwick," Michael said, voice gone low and rough at the edges, gold bleeding faintly into his eyes, "will remove his hand." Daniel, to his credit, removed his hand. "My apologies, Your Majesty," he said, entirely unbothered, and smiling in a way that suggested he'd gotten exactly the reaction he wanted. "I simply hadn't realized the healer was spoken for." "He's mated," Michael said, and the word came out with an edge sharp enough to cut before he seemed to hear himself and cleared his throat, and added, with considerably less growl and considerably more of the careful diplomacy his position required, "As it happens." "Since when?" Daniel asked, delighted, clearly enjoying every second of the king's unraveling composure. "Since the forest," James said, taking pity on absolutely no one, least of all himself, because watching Michael flustered was rapidly becoming his favorite pastime in the entire castle. "It's a whole story. There was a wolf, and I called him a smug dog, and it went rather well from there." The hall's tension broke into scattered laughter, and Daniel, with the grace of a man who knew when a game was well and truly lost, raised his cup in James's direction. "Then I concede, healer. Though I'll admit I'm curious how a smug dog earns forgiveness." "Extensive groveling," James said. "And ruining my chamomile, apparently, though I've been assured that part was accidental." Later, once the feast had wound down and the hall had emptied to its usual echoing quiet, Michael found James on the garden wall again, moonbright and cool, and settled beside him with the sheepish look of a man aware he'd behaved badly and not remotely sorry about it. "You growled at a visiting lord," James said. "At a diplomatic feast. He touched your hand. He barely touched my hand. I am aware," Michael said, "that my behavior was excessive." "It was extremely excessive." James bumped his shoulder against Michael's, grinning into the dark. "It was also the most flattering thing anyone's done for me since I arrived, so. Excessive and effective. I won't complain." Michael turned his head, gold eyes soft in the moonlight, and James thought, not for the first time, but with new and startling clarity, that he had never, not once, felt this steady standing beside William. Whatever he'd had before had been comfortable. This was something else entirely, a current under still water, a bond that hummed instead of merely existing. "For what it's worth," Michael said quietly, "I've never growled at anyone before you. Charles will tell you, I'm famously even-tempered, diplomatic to a fault. I've ruined you." "Thoroughly," Michael agreed, and kissed him again, slow and certain under the autumn moon, and James decided that being ruined, on the whole, suited him rather well. The first snow of the season came early and heavy, blanketing the castle terraces in white by the time James woke, and he found Michael already out on the highest balcony, in nothing but a thin shirt, apparently immune to weather in a way James found both impressive and deeply irritating at 7 in the morning. "You'll freeze," James informed him, wrapping a blanket around his own shoulders and stepping out to join him regardless of his own advice. Wolves run warm. You're not currently a wolf. A technicality, Michael said, and drew James in against his side anyway, sharing the blanket, tucking him close beneath his arm until the cold became something distant and unimportant. Below them, the castle grounds lay hushed and white, smoke rising thin from the kitchen chimneys, a lone stable hand cutting a dark trail of footprints toward the horses. "It's beautiful," James said softly, breath fogging in the cold air. "It is," Michael agreed, though when James glanced up, he found the king wasn't looking at the snow at all. They stood there a long while, quiet in the way that had become comfortable between them over the past months. No need to fill every silence, no fear that stillness meant distance. James thought of how different this quiet felt from every quiet he'd known with William. Not an absence of things to say, but a fullness that needed no words at all. "I've been trying to find the right moment for this," Michael said eventually. Voice gone careful in a way James had learned meant something important was coming. "I don't think there is one. I think I'm simply going to have to say it badly, standing in the cold, and hope you forgive the lack of ceremony." James turned to face him fully, heart picking up. "Michael, I love you." The words came out plain and unadorned, none of the practiced eloquence Michael brought to his council speeches, and somehow that made them land harder, truer. "I loved you before I understood what the bond meant. I think some foolish part of me loved you from the moment you called me a smug dog, and meant every word of it, because nobody in 28 years had ever spoken to me like I was simply a person standing in a forest, and not a crown wearing a body. I love the way you scold me over dead chamomile. I love that you cried under a beech tree and let me hold you through it. I love you plainly, entirely, without a single reservation left in me, and I wanted you to hear it said in full daylight, sober and certain, not swept up in a ceremony or a feast or anything grander than two people standing in the snow." James opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time since he'd arrived at Drachenfels, that words entirely failed him. So he answered the only way that felt true enough, closing the distance and kissing Michael there in the falling snow, slow and sure, both of them laughing softly against each other's mouths, when a fat snowflake landed directly on James's nose, and he had to pull back to sneeze. "That," Michael said, delighted, "was easily the least dignified moment of my entire courtship." "You growled at a lord over a breakfast tray," James reminded him, still laughing. "You lost the dignity contest weeks ago, fair." Michael tucked him closer still, resting his chin atop James's head, and James felt the words settle into his chest alongside the bond thread, warm and certain and entirely his to keep. "Say it back whenever you're ready. There's no hurry. I've waited 28 years. I can wait a little longer for the right moment." "I don't need a moment," James said, muffled against his shirt. "I love you too, Michael. I think I've loved you since the second night, if I'm honest. Somewhere between the dead chamomile and you trying to blame it on a rabbit. I was just waiting to see if you'd say it first, because I am, apparently, exactly as much of a coward about this as you are. We make quite a matched pair, then. The most matched," James agreed, and they stood there in the snow a long while longer, in no hurry at all to go back inside. The letter arrived on a gray morning 10 days later, carried by a messenger who'd clearly run the last mile, and James recognized his brother's terrible handwriting on the seal before he'd even broken it. "James, I know I have no right to ask. William told the whole village what happened, and it's gotten twisted into something worse than the truth. And Mother's stopped speaking to either of us. I'm coming to Drachenfels. Please don't set me on fire. Robert, he thinks I have fire magic," James told Michael, showing him the letter over breakfast. "I am a healer. I know how to set bones and brew tonics. I do not have fire magic. I don't know where he's gotten this idea. You did threaten to drop a jar on his head. That was restraint, actually, comparatively." Robert arrived 2 days later, road-worn and visibly braced for violence, and found James waiting for him in the castle's lower courtyard with his arms crossed and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "I'm not going to set you on fire," James said, before Robert could open his mouth. "Thank you," Robert said, with feeling. "I'm also not currently sure I want to hug you, so let's just stand here and see how this goes." They stood there. It went for a while badly, Robert apologizing in the tumbling, over-explaining way he'd apologized for everything since they were children, James listening with his jaw tight and his arms still crossed, the old hurt sitting sour in his chest even with the bond thread, to Michael humming warm and certain just behind his ribs, proof that he'd landed somewhere so much better than where he'd fallen from. "It wasn't about you," Robert said finally, miserably. "I know that doesn't help." "It wasn't. I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because I'm a coward who couldn't say no to something I wanted. And I told myself it didn't count because you never seemed like you sparked, James. I told myself I was doing you a favor. I know that's not an excuse. I know it's the worst kind of excuse. I miss my brother." James looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The courtyard hushed around them, and felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight since that morning at the window, finally slowly begin to loosen. "We didn't spark," he admitted. "You're right about that. I think some small, stupid part of me knew it for years, and just didn't want to be right about something so lonely." He uncrossed his arms. "I forgive you. Not because what you did was fine. It wasn't. And William's a separate matter I have significantly less patience for. But because you're my brother, and holding on to this is heavier than I want to carry into whatever's happening here." Robert's face crumpled with relief, and the hug that followed was fierce and a little too tight and entirely finally real. "Also," James added, muffled against his brother's shoulder, "I've met someone. The whole village knows. William's been insufferable about it, actually. Says you've run off and gotten yourself tangled with royalty out of spite." "It is not out of spite," James said, pulling back, affronted. "Well, perhaps 8% spite. The other 92% is that he's genuinely wonderful, and I'd have fallen for him even if William had been perfectly faithful, which, for the record, is a low bar he still somehow failed to clear." It was at that precise moment that William himself stepped through the courtyard gate, having, it emerged, followed Robert the entire way to make amends, which was a generous description of what was, more accurately, a poorly timed attempt to see whether the king's mate story had been exaggerated. James felt Michael's presence arrive behind him before he heard footsteps, a warmth at his back, solid and certain, and did not need to turn around to know the king's jaw had gone tight at the sight of the man who'd broken his mate's heart. "You must be William," Michael said, with the icy, immaculate courtesy of a monarch who had decided, in the space of one breath, exactly how much he disliked someone. William, to his credit, had the sense to look thoroughly cowed. "Your Majesty, I only came to see if the rumors were true," Michael finished for him. "They are. James is mine. I'd ask that you make your peace with that quickly, for your own comfort, because I am considerably less patient than he is." "I don't want him back," William said quickly, hands raised. I wanted to apologize, properly. Not the way I did it before." James studied him for a long moment. The boy he'd loved at 19, smaller now somehow, or perhaps James had simply grown past the shape of him, and found, to his mild surprise, that he had room enough left for one more small mercy that afternoon. "Apology accepted," he said. "Badly delivered, appallingly timed, but accepted. Go home, William. Marry someone who actually sparks for you. I hear the miller's daughter's been asking after you, and unlike me, she doesn't have a wolf king standing behind her, ready to make your life extremely difficult." William left considerably faster than he'd arrived. That evening, with Robert settled into a guest chamber, and the courtyard quiet under early stars, James found Michael on the highest terrace, looking out over the dark shape of the Rhine, shoulders held with a tension James had learned, over the past weeks, to recognize as worry rather than temper. "You're brooding," James said, coming to lean against the balustrade beside him. "I can tell. You get a very specific face. I'm not brooding. You are radiating brood, tell me." Michael was quiet for a moment, jaw working, and James waited, because he'd learned that too. That the king, so certain and commanding in council, needed a little more room to say the things that actually frightened him. "The Eastern Pax came for more than trade," Michael said finally. "Lord Fenwick's sister, Lady Alara. The council's been pressing me for a political match with her for 2 years. Peace along the border, secured through marriage. I've refused it twice. I'll refuse it again. But the pressure's grown worse since word spread that I've bonded a village healer instead of a noble's daughter, and I find myself—" He stopped, exhaled hard, gold eyes troubled in the dark. "I find myself afraid that loving you the way I do isn't going to be enough against an entire council convinced I've chosen wrong." James felt something cold slide through him. Not doubt in Michael, never that, but the old familiar fear of being someone's inconvenient truth rather than their easy choice. He thought of William's blanket pulled up in shame. He thought of standing in a window, laughing so he wouldn't cry. He did not run this time. He'd learned that much, at least. "Do you think you chose wrong?" he asked instead, quiet and steady. "No," Michael said, immediately, fiercely, turning to face him fully. "Not for one single moment. I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of you, James. That isn't the fear. The fear is that certainty won't be enough to silence a council that measures worth in territory and titles." "Then let them measure," James said. "I'm not asking you to fight your council for me, Michael. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you do it yourself, because it's your fight too, and I'd rather face a room of disapproving nobles at your side than sit safely elsewhere while you do it alone." Michael looked at him like he'd been handed something he hadn't known he was allowed to want, and the fear in his face eased, slowly, into something steadier. "There's a claiming ceremony," he said. "Public, binding before the whole court and every visiting lord. If I do it, if I claim you formally before all of them, there's no more question left to press. No more room for the council's arguments." His hands found James's, careful the way they'd been careful in the forest that very first night. "It's not a small thing to ask. Every eye in 3 kingdoms would be on you." "Good," James said, lacing their fingers together, steady despite the flutter in his chest. "Let them look. I've survived worse audiences than a room full of nobles. At least this time I'll be standing next to someone who actually deserves me." Michael laughed, startled and warm, and kissed him there on the terrace with the whole dark river glittering below, and James thought that this exact ordinary miracle of being chosen, loudly on purpose, in front of everyone, was worth every mile he'd walked lost through a forest to find it. The great hall of Drachenfels had never been so full. James stood at its center in a coat, the deep blue of dusk, hands only slightly unsteady, Robert beaming from the front row beside Charles, who had, by all accounts, finally collected his winnings from the entire betting staff. Michael crossed the hall to him in the white ceremonial coat of his line, and for a moment James forgot every noble watching, every murmur of the Eastern delegation, every ounce of pressure this ceremony was meant to answer, because Michael's eyes, when they met his, held nothing but that same fierce, gentled wonder from the very first night in the forest. "James Whitmore," Michael said, voice carrying clear and steady through the hushed hall. "Healer, and the only person alive who has ever called me a smug dog and meant it as an insult." Laughter rippled through the crowd. James bit back his own grin. "I claim you before this court, before my council, before every kingdom watching, as my true mate and my equal, not despite what you are, but because of it. There is no argument left to make against a bond the both of us have felt, unmistakably, since the moment you touched my fur in a dark forest and were not, for one single instant, afraid." "I was a little afraid," James murmured, just for him. "You called me a smug dog to my face. That was bravado, entirely different." The hall laughed again, and Michael's mouth curved, warm and helpless, before he steadied himself for the final words. Old words, the shifter bond words spoken at every true claiming for 100 generations. And James, when his turn came, spoke his own back without a single tremor, because for the first time in his life he was choosing, and being chosen in the full light of day, with nothing hidden and nothing to run from. When Michael kissed him, the whole hall erupted, nobles and staff and Robert whooping loud enough to embarrass them both, and James felt the bond thread between them settle into something permanent, something that would hold no matter what any council decided, because it had never needed their permission at all. Later, near the edge of the celebration, Lord Fenwick found James by the wine table and raised his cup with a rueful, genuine smile. "I concede properly this time," he said. "You make a far better king's mate than a serving boy healer." "You know," James said, studying him over the rim of his own cup, "I never did work out whether you actually wanted me, or whether you simply enjoyed watching Michael turn purple." Daniel laughed, unbothered, entirely caught out. "Both at first, if I'm honest. You're easy to admire. But mostly the second, I'll admit. Your king's composure is legendary across 3 kingdoms, and I couldn't resist seeing what it took to crack it. My sister will be relieved, incidentally. She's been dreading this match rather more than the council realizes. She has a sweetheart of her own back home she's far too polite to mention to anyone with a crown. I only ever came to see the marriage refused gracefully. You've simply made it considerably more entertaining to watch, so all that hand-holding at the feast. Purely for research," Daniel said, grinning. Michael's growl carries remarkably far, for the record. I'd wager half the Eastern delegation heard it, and drew their own conclusions before the council did. "You're a menace. I'm efficient," Daniel corrected. "Try the chamomile tea, healer. I finally managed to grow some the wolves haven't trampled." "That's my line," James said, and Daniel only winked and melted back into the crowd, leaving James laughing despite himself, all the old wariness gone clean out of him. Charles found him not long after, already 3 cups deep into the castle's best wine, and looking, for once, entirely unguarded. No dry wit, no arch commentary, just a man watching his oldest friend across a crowded hall, with something close to relief. 20 years I've known him," Charles said, without preamble, nodding toward Michael, who stood surrounded by well-wishers and looked, for the first time in James's memory, entirely unbothered by the attention. 20 years of watching him carry this kingdom like it might crack if he set it down for even an evening. I've never once seen him laugh the way he laughs at your terrible jokes. My jokes are excellent. Your jokes are dreadful, Charles said, with great affection. That's rather the point. He doesn't need someone to be impressed by him, James. He's had a lifetime of that. He needed someone who'd throw a dead chamomile plant at his head and mean it kindly. James felt something in his chest go warm and full at that, watching Michael across the hall, head tipped back mid-law at something a small child had apparently said to him with great seriousness, crown askew, dignity entirely forgotten, and thought that Charles, dry-humored and endlessly amused as he was, had a way of saying the truest things sideways, when he thought no one was paying close enough attention to notice. "Come dance with your king," Charles said, nudging him bodily toward the center of the hall before James could formulate a proper response. Before Otto attempts it first and breaks something. He's been eyeing the wine table for an hour building up his courage, and I would very much like my healer rested for tomorrow's inevitable injuries rather than dealing with them tonight. James let himself be steered, laughing, and Michael turned the moment he felt him near, some instinct that had nothing to do with sound, only the bond thread singing its quiet, certain note, and reached for his hand without a single word needing to pass between them, drawing him into the dance with the same careful, unhurried patience he'd shown that very first night in the forest. "Charles tells me I don't need to be impressive," James murmured, close to his ear, as they turned slow circles beneath the great hall's high windows. "Charles talks too much," Michael said, though there was no real complaint in it, though he's not wrong. "You've never once needed to impress me, James. You simply needed to exist in the same forest I happened to be standing in, and I'd have found my way to you regardless. That's disgustingly romantic for a man who once growled at a lord over a breadbasket." "I contain multitudes," Michael said gravely, and James laughed loud enough that half the hall turned to look, and did not care one single bit. They traveled to Ravensdale that spring, once the roads had cleared, and James stood again at the edge of the same forest he'd once fled into, lost and heartbroken, and found he could look at it now without a single flinch, only a small, private fondness, the way one looks back at the worst night of a story that turned out, in the end, to have a very good ending. His mother wept when she saw him, and wept harder when she saw the crown mark stitched discreetly into his collar, and the whole village turned out to gawk at the Alpha King of Drachenfels standing in their square, patient and warm, shaking hands with the same neighbors who'd gossiped about James for weeks. William, true to James's prediction, had indeed begun courting the miller's daughter, and had the good sense to keep a respectful distance and simply wave, which James returned without malice, because there was at last none left in him to spend. "You seem happy," Robert said, watching Michael crouched at the edge of the square, entirely undignified, letting a gaggle of village children pet his white wolf coat, while he was still very much aware he was a king doing this in front of half the village. "I am," James said, and meant it so completely that the words felt almost too small for the size of the feeling. Robert's new mate, a sharp-tongued stonemason's daughter named Greta, whom James had liked instantly on the sole grounds that she'd interrupted Robert mid-apology to inform him he was explaining himself far too much, joined them with 2 cups of warm cider, handing one to James without being asked. "He's told me the whole story," Greta said, nodding toward Robert. "Twice, very thoroughly. I feel I know your brother's every regret in intimate detail." "He does that," James said, grinning. "I like him anyway," Greta said, unbothered, and looped her arm through Robert's, who went faintly pink with the particular helpless happiness of a man who had, against every early indication, ended up rather better off than he deserved. James caught his brother's eye over her head and found nothing left between them but plain, uncomplicated fondness. The old wound closed over clean, the way a bone sets stronger at the break once it's properly healed. The following's spring-married life at Drachenfels, James had quickly discovered, was considerably less dignified than any of the old stories about kings and their consorts had led him to expect. There were no grand processions most mornings. There was, more often than not, a king attempting to sneak an extra pastry past his own kitchen staff, or complaining with great solemnity about council meetings that ran long, or, on one memorable occasion, not long after the claiming, trying to convince James that a wolf's sense of smell made him uniquely qualified to judge whether a stew needed more salt, an argument James had dismantled within 30 seconds and never let him forget. "You said I had a superior palate," Michael reminded him one evening, over dinner, still faintly wounded whenever the subject resurfaced. "I said no such thing. I said your nose was useful for finding truffles. That is an entirely different compliment." It felt like the same compliment at the time. "That's a you problem," James said, and stole a piece of bread directly off his husband's plate in retaliation for the ongoing grudge, and Michael let him, because he let James get away with nearly everything these days. A full season into marriage now, a fact Charles brought up with tiresome regularity. The garden at Drachenfels had, against considerable odds, finally flourished, and James stood in the middle of it on a spring morning, holding a very dead chamomile plant and staring at his husband with an expression of profound betrayal. "Michael." "It followed me," Michael said, from where he sat on the garden wall looking entirely too pleased with himself, for a man who ruled an entire kingdom and could not, apparently, be trusted within 10 feet of a herb bed. "The rabbit ran through the bed. I was pursuing the rabbit. This is not my fault." "You are the Alpha King of Drachenfels," James said, "and you cannot outmaneuver a single rabbit. The rabbit is exceptionally clever. It's a rabbit, Michael." "A clever one," Michael insisted, and James threw the dead chamomile plant at him, gently, mostly for effect, and Michael caught it out of the air with the reflexes of a man who'd spent a lifetime dodging council daggers, disguised as compliments, and grinned at him with the particular unguarded joy that still, months into marriage, made James's chest go warm and full every single time. "That's the 4th one this season," James said, settling onto the wall beside him, unable to hold on to the mock outrage for more than a few seconds in the face of that grin. "I'll have Charles plant a new one. Charles has told me, in writing, that he refuses to be your gardening apology system any longer." "Then I'll plant it myself," Michael said, with great and unconvincing dignity. "You will kill it within a week." "Possibly," Michael admitted, and pulled James against his side. Warm in the morning sun, the whole quiet castle humming gently around them. Charles somewhere below shouting good-naturedly at a training recruit, the kitchen staff arguing over the breakfast menu, the Rhine sliding silver and slow past the cliffs exactly as it had the very first morning James arrived here, lost and heartbroken and entirely unaware that he was walking toward the best thing that would ever happen to him. "I keep thinking," James said quietly, resting his head against Michael's shoulder, "about how furious I was that morning, climbing through that window. I thought my whole life had just ended, and now I think it's very funny," James said, "that the worst morning of my life turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I walked into a forest to cry in peace and found a king instead." "A smug one," Michael reminded him, solemn. "The smudgest," James agreed, tipping his fist up for a kiss, unhurried and entirely certain, before either of them bothered getting up from the ruined chamomile bed at all. A letter arrived that afternoon from Ravensdale, Robert's handwriting, still terrible, announcing with considerable excitement that he'd finally bonded properly to a stonemason's daughter with a temper Robert described, admiringly, as worse than yours, somehow, and that the whole village wanted to know when James and his king might visit again, preferably before the summer festival, preferably with fewer wolves accompanying him this time, since the goats had never quite recovered from the last visit. "We should go," James said, tucking the letter into his pocket. "Robert deserves to have us there, and I want to see if this stonemason's daughter really is worse tempered than me, because I have my doubts." "You have a great many doubts about your own temper for a man who once threatened to drop a jar on someone's head," That was restraint, I keep telling people. Extremely restrained, Michael agreed, entirely too fondly, and pulled James close again, the dead chamomile plant abandoned in the grass between them. Later, as the sun slid low and gold over the Rhine, and the castle settled into its familiar evening noise, Charles shouting good-naturedly at recruits below, kitchen staff bickering over the supper menu, somewhere in the distance the faint, delighted shriek of a stable boy who had apparently just discovered that one of the king's wolves had eaten an entire tray of pastries meant for the evening meal. James thought that this was, perhaps, the truest ending any story about him could have offered. Not a grand rescue, not a battle won. Just an ordinary, laughing, thoroughly undignified life, built one dead chamomile plant at a time, with a king who had once sat very still in a dark forest and let a heartbroken stranger call him a smug dog, and loved him anyway, from that very first moment onward, and somewhere in the grass nearby, thoroughly unbothered by the royal drama it had caused, a rabbit twitched its ears and hopped calmly away. If this story made you laugh, ache, or root for James even a little, tell us in the comments. We genuinely love reading which moments stuck with you most. A like and a subscribe means the world and keeps these stories coming, so thank you for sitting with us through this one.